All right. Good evening, everyone. So we, in the last two sessions, established this is going to be the third and final session of the grouping of Torah Messinai and the life's biggest questions related to what exactly we received at Har Sinai, and where the first week what we discussed was mass revelation. The second week we discussed the actual body of Torah that we received at Har Sinai, where we came down according to the Rambam. Basically, it's that we received the 613 commandments and the details that are necessary and unchanging, or not unchanging, undeveloped further to understand the 613 mitzvos, and then the principles to develop the Torah further. We received at Har Sinai, developed more Torah into the world. And tonight, what I want to discuss is basically how we got from the revelation at Sinai to the way we practice Judaism in 2022. Where what has happened? Has anything changed? What has developed, and how did that development take place? That's basically what our focus is going to be tonight, and the time allotted to us. So, number one, we have to start by just pointing out that the verb or adjective changed is not something we're allowed to use when it comes to Torah. Torah, one of our principles of faith, is that the Torah we have, eina muchlefes, can never be changed. It is unchanging, and it's the exact Torah that we received at Har Sinai, which is a little bit difficult to comprehend at that surface level, because what do you mean? Hanukkah didn't exist at Mount Sinai. So then how could it be that we are saying that Torah is unchanging if there is a new Torah that is being developed constantly? When I say constantly, I mean, just this pandemic, that we just experienced is a great example of that there were situations that arose that we had never dealt with before. Moshe Rabbeinu never dealt with how to decide who gets a ventilator, right? That's something that never had come up before. New vaccines and the halacha pertaining to the distribution of those vaccines. These are things that hadn't come up before. So then how can we say the Torah is unchanging? So the first thing is we need to just come to an understanding of, let's start from Har Sinai, and then we'll work our way downwards. So we'll work our way down the mountain. Heard that one, Jack? We'll work our way down the mountain. So at Har Sinai, as we mentioned, we received the 613 commandments, the details that are necessary to fulfill those 613 commandments. And then we also received the principles of elucidation. Whereas we pointed out from the Rambam, there are really 5 categories of Torah. The 5 categories of Torah are, number one, Perushim Mikubalim, the universally accepted understandings of certain psukim in the Torah, like the fact that we use an esrog on sukkahs. All it says in the Torah is a pri-eitz hadar, a beautiful fruit. What does a beautiful fruit mean? It doesn't mean a strawberry. It doesn't mean an apple. It doesn't mean an orange. It means only one thing. It means an esrog. That is a universally accepted understanding of a verse in the Torah. Number 2 is traditions straight from Har Sinai that have no source text to them at all. They are simply traditions. An example is that the Torah tells us tells us we need to wear tefillin. What does tefillin look like? What is its shape? What's its color? The fact that it's square and it's black. All of this is straight tradition from Har Sinai. Number 3 is, and those 2 areas of Torah are what we referred to last time as Torah that cannot be developed further. This is Torah that has not opened for discussion. There's no argument that could be had. We gave a perfect proof for that. Perfect example of that was the lineage of David HaMelech. Whether or not Rus's conversion was legitimate is dependent upon whether or not it's something that was derived from verses in the Torah, whether or not the prohibition of someone from Moab, a female from Moab, doing conversion is the permissibility for that derived from elucidation of a verse, or was it something that was based off of a tradition? If it's something that was based off of understanding of verses in the Torah, then it's open for discussion. And you had Doeg Hadomi come and try and completely uproot the lineage of David HaMelech by basically proving from verses that a female Moabite is not allowed to join the Jewish people. And came along Yeser Yishmaeli, the Talmud says, and he girded his sword and said that I have a tradition from Shmuel Hanavi, that this is a tradition, meaning a halacha l'Moshe Sinai. I have a tradition from Har Sinai that the permissibility from a female Moabite to join the Jewish people is a tradition. It is not learned from verses. Therefore, it's not open for discussion, and the discussion ended. The Brisk Rav explains because the difference between something that is elucidated in the psukim, something that you have to derive based off of a drasha through learning and elucidating and expounding the verse in the Torah, it's up for discussion. Someone may come up with a different reading than you had come up with. However, if it's something that's based off of tradition, that's something that's not open for discussion. So that's what the Brisk Rav said. That's why David HaMelech's lineage is completely kosher, because no one could argue whether or not a female from Moab is allowed to convert, because it's something based off tradition. The third area of Torah, and from the rest of the areas of Torah, then it's open for discussion. Number 3 is elucidating verses in the Torah. There you have what it's referred to in the Gemara in Eruvin on Daf Yud Daled as Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim. That this one and that one both say, and there are multiple truths. Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim. It's the word of God, and it's chayim. It's the living word of God. So it's where you have, different explanations given by Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel how to understand different verses in the Torah. For example, there's a discussion right in the beginning of Masechta Sanhedrin. How many judges are required to decide cases of loans? That if a loan was paid up or not paid up, and there's a dispute that's brought in front of a rabbinical judge, how many judges are needed to decide that case? Do you need 3 judges, or is 1 judge good enough? It's machlokas right in the beginning of Sanhedrin. That's a good example, because they were elucidating verses in the Torah and expounding upon verses in the Torah, and you have these 2 opinions. Both of those opinions are true and correct. How we follow is a different story. We'll get to that in a second, how we follow in each of those scenarios. But nevertheless, both opinions are true, which is why it's open for discussion. The way Rav Shechter, a phraseology that he coined in explaining this concept of Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim is that God likes variety. God likes variety. He was interested in the Torah being expounded in this kind of a way that there is so much contained within every verse in the Torah that you could have multiple truths that come out from the same verse in the Torah. That is the third area, drushos. Those 3 areas, are the 3 areas that comprise of biblical law.
I'm still confused. So was this the 3 of the 613, and the details, which are the details includes the traditions and the things learned from the verses, or just
the things learned from the verses that are universally accepted. Then the third area.
And what about the traditions also in that part?
Yes. Then the third area of Torah is where you have machlokas, is where it's open to discussion. Is you can have one verse learned in multiple ways, and both are correct. That's the third area of Torah.
So then what came at Sinai,
we're just the first 2. Exactly.
First 2.
We're just the first 2, exactly. Just the first 2 received at Sinai. And then the third area, the rest of biblical law, is something that we had continued to develop for a certain period of time. We'll get to where that ended shortly, but that's what we continued to develop beyond them. Those first three areas is what comprises biblical law. Then you have areas number 4 and 5, which is basically rabbinic law, is all the enactments that were made by Chazal, by our rabbis, reading the Megillah, Purim, Hanukkah, washing the Tilas Yadayim. These are things that are, blessings we make on food. All of rabbinic law was all developed by the rabbis later. And then number 5 is traditions, customs. Whether or not you pray from a Ashkenaz siddur or a Sephardic siddur, whether or not you cover the challahs when you make the hamotzi, or you keep them uncovered when you make hamotzi. These, whether or not you say during Havdalah, borei atze bisamim or borei mine bisamim, these are all customs, and that's the 5th area of Torah. Okay, so these are the 5 areas of Torah according to the Rambam. Now, all of that we just described up until around the year 200 Common Era, around the year 200, everything we just described was all oral, where you had the written text of the Torah, and then until about the year 200, it was all oral. And then, due to influence from the Greeks, so there was a major assimilation that was taking place, and Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Judah the Prince, said that if we don't do something now to try and collect these traditions, which were already, by the way, starting to be collected. They were starting to be collected in the Sifrei and the Sifra and the Tosefta, not in the full breadth of Torah like Rabbi did, not in as organized as a fashion as Rabbi did, but there were some written traditions already, some traditions that were put into writing in around the 1st and 2nd century. The Zohar also was in the 2nd century, around the year 160, 170 CE. And then came along Rebbe, who said, you know what, we need to have a really good methodology to be able to comprise all of our oral traditions into some sort of what we'll call like Cliff Notes, okay? Where like when you're in school and you forgot that you had to read the entire book by a certain date, so you have Cliff Notes that you read through, and you think you're an expert on the book because you read through the Cliff Notes. Now, Cliff Notes is exactly that. It's not the book, and therefore no one can claim to be an expert on Shakespeare from reading all of Shakespeare's Cliff Notes. You can't claim to be an expert on Shakespeare by reading the Cliff Notes. This is the same thing, Lahavdal Alfei Avdalos, applies to the Mishnah. No one can claim to be a Talmud Chacham if they just know all the Mishnayot. If a person just knows the Mishnayot, then you're missing a lot. Why? Because the Mishnayot, this is explained by the Tiferes Yisrael, that he explains that the Mishnayot were, as we mentioned, Cliff Notes. They were designed by Rebbe in order to keep the oral tradition alive, to keep the discussion alive. When a person reads a Mishnah, what is supposed to happen to them, it's supposed to trigger them to ask questions and to receive counsel, to receive counsel from their Rebbe in order to understand the Mishnah. There are certain things contained in the Mishnah that are obvious mistakes that Rebbe HaKadosh made, or that he writes the Mishnah clearly not the way that we paskin. And he does, or he'll write it out of order, or he'll do things like that just to spark a person's interest and to get a person to think that, wait, this can't be correct. Oh, right, because this is what's correct. And if he just wrote it as the bottom line halacha, so then it would have, number one, destroyed all rabbinic creativity. That's number one, which we weren't finished with rabbinic creativity yet. There was still smicha. There was still the ability to elucidate the verses more, to have more discussion in Torah Shema Peh. That wasn't finished yet. That's number one. And number two is that we would have been following only one opinion. We would have just been following the opinion of Rabbi. But Rabbi knew, and of course it requires humility to be able to do this, said it's not about me. It's about what he said is that I'm doing this for the sake of God, and I want to make sure that Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim Chaim remains, the ability to have these multiple truths, the ability to have discussion of the Torah, and that was the whole purpose of the Mishnah. So Rebbe organized all of the oral traditions into the 6 orders of the Mishnah, comprising all of Jewish law and tradition. Okay. Now, Rebbe was very successful. Now, what's the greatest proof that Rebbe was so successful? The Talmud. The Talmud is the Talmud, both the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud. Both of them, where the Jerusalem Talmud came first and was finished editing first, and then Ravina and Ravashi had edited the Jerusalem, the Babylonian Talmud, the Talmud Bavli, in around the 6th century, in the middle of the 6th century, and what is contained within the Talmud are all of those discussions that we had just described, that all the discussions Rebbe wanted to continue to happen through his bringing down the Mishnah, all is contained within both of those Talmuds. Once the Talmud was completed and it was edited around that time from Ravina and Rav Ashi. By the way, Ravina's Yortzeit is exactly 2 days after Rabbi Yehuda Anasi. Rabbi Yehuda Anasi's Yortzeit, I believe, is Yud Gimel Kislev, and Ravina, who was the co-editor of the Gemara, his Yortzeit, I believe, is Tet Vav Kislev, and so what they did is now they basically wanted to accomplish something similar to Rebbe HaKadosh, not just as mnemonic devices, but as living examples of how to work over Torah, of how to reattach yourself to the traditions contained within the Mishnah, and going back to Sinai, of that our goal is to try and understand Torah, again, going all the way back to Sinai, trying to understand the 613 commandments, the details of those commandments, and the written text of the Torah that had been elucidated and expounded on from Sinai all the way till right now in our day and age. And that was what they wanted to compile within the Talmud. And contained within that is all the Rabbinic law and all those customs that we had spoken about as areas number 4 and 5. All the Rabbinic law and all of the customs are obviously contained within the Talmud as well in those discussions.
So the Rabbinic law is the thing that I don't understand so well, because.
So we're going to get that right now.
Okay.
We're going to get to that right now. Yeah. Okay. So now we made it down the mountain, starting from Har Sinai to the Talmud. Now, till the conclusion of the Talmud. Now, the Vilna Gaon, passed away in 1792. Was one of the greatest geniuses. Was probably the greatest Talmud Chacham. Rabbi Eliyahu Gaon Vilna. By the way, on the back side of your sheet, this is just both of these. By the way, I'd highly recommend just holding on to and keeping, because they're just fantastic reference charts. Where the Vilna Gaon, I believe he passed away. It's on the bottom half of the page. The Achronim. We'll talk about the difference in Rishonim and Achronim in a moment. He's in there. He's probably on the top half of the page. The Ramban. Well, it's in. The Ramban passed away in 1270, right? So it's in the middle of the top half of the page somewhere.
Well, no, 1270 you have is Ramban.
Oh, the Rambam passed away in 1204, right? So you just go up a little bit more. He's there. Oh yeah, yes. Those on the Zoom, certainly you can get a copy of the handout. I'll I'll make sure to include it in the email that goes out with the class recording. So the Vilna Gaon passed away in what did I say? 12. Oh, I was wrong. I was off by 5 years. 1297. So the Vilna Gaon says that when Ravina and Rav Ashi had finished the canonization, we'll call it, of the Talmud, they closed the books on that editing. So the Gemara in Bava Metzia tells us on Daf Pei Hey or Pei Vav, it says Ravina and Rav Ashi sof hora, that when Ravina and Rav Ashi completed the editing of the Talmud, it was what was called sof hora, the end of rabbinic developments. The end of rabbinic hora is to make a halachic ruling. It was the end of formal halachic rulings. Torah ceased to be developed further in an authoritative way once the Talmud was closed. And I'll explain to you what I mean by that. The Torah tells us in Parsha Shoftim, the Torah tells us that lo saser memash yagidu l'cha yamin u'shmol, that when the Sanhedrin made a ruling, made a decision about something, they made a new law, they made a directive, they made a ruling on a capital case, whatever it was, they developed new halacha, which that was the role of the Sanhedrin, that they sat, the Beis HaMikdash was the center of Torah Sheba'al Peh. All of the Torah that was being developed, as we spoke about, was coming from, for the most part, was coming from the Sanhedrin that sat at the Lishkas Hagazis, that in on the Temple Mount. The Torah tells us that when the Sanhedrin comes to a halachic ruling, you're not allowed to deviate from that halachic ruling, right or left. Lo saser mashi yagidu l'cha yamin u'shmol. Rav Elchanan Wasserman explains that this is the source, as the Gemara tells us in a couple of different places. This is the source of the ability for the rabbis to create halacha. Now, they're not adding on 614th or 613th mitzvah. What they're doing is applying the principles of the Torah into new law, new legislation. For example, Hanukkah candles. Doesn't say anywhere in the Torah you have to light Hanukkah candles. What does it say in the Torah? What it says in the Torah is that when a miracle happens, we're supposed to give Hodah, we're supposed to give thanks to Hashem. What's the proof of that? Pesach. Pesach is the proof of that. Now, how did they know to choose specifically Hanukkah candles? Because the miracle happened with the menorah, and therefore we're going to base a lot of our rulings about the miracle of the light, basing it off of the menorah that took place in the temple, that stood in the temple. Okay. When the rabbis made that decision that they want to have this new rabbinic enactment in place, using this principle of lo sasor, and we can't deviate from it. And as Rav Elchanan Wasserman explains, that it's either because they understand that they're using this authority that God had endowed upon them, or it's that they are trying to help us fulfill the will of God, whatever it might be. But regardless, whether it be just like Xeris HaKasav, a verse in the Torah that does not necessarily have specific rhyme or reason to it, or it's something that, no, it's that the rabbis are passing all this legislation just to help us fulfill the will of God more, meaning it's getting back to the biblical, the getting back to Torah on a biblical level. So then once that happens, so then it becomes binding that the Jewish people need to fulfill, which really basically means that every single rabbinic law, really its basis is in biblical law. And if it wasn't, then they wouldn't have the right to do what they did, right? All rabbinic law was using their authority of lo sasor, where the Torah tells me, were supposed to follow the directives of the rabbis. This gave them the ability to create all that new legislation. And the reason they created that legislation, Rav Chaim Washman explains, is because it is the rabbis who are the Balei HaMesorah, those who understand the tradition best, helping us fulfill the Ratzon of Hashem, fulfill the will of God.
This rabbinic law is done before it was codified and written down.
So now, all of that we just described of rabbinic law is what ended when Ravina and stopped being developed when Ravina and Rav Ashi compiled the Talmud. Once they finished compiling the Talmud, that was because rabbinic development was stopping already at that point, and therefore they compiled it all into the Talmud. That's what the Gra explains. The Vilna Gaon explains exactly that. That when the Talmud tells me Ravina and Rav Ashi Sof Hora, Ravina and Rav Ashi were the end of rabbinic creativity and legislation, that means that new legislation is no longer allowed to be passed from the time that the Talmud was edited. From that point on, no new rabbinic legislation was able to be passed.
Then, I mean, now, of course, there's people that, the pandemic.
So we'll get there also. Okay. We're only about 1,000 years down the mountain. We got ways to go.
So in these first 1,000 years,
We still got another about 1,500 years to make it down the mountain.
so how did the law become law? I mean,
It was passed in the Sanhedrin, similar to like when a law is passed in Supreme Court. Yes. Yeah, exactly that. That is exactly very, very well said, Jack. That's like the Gemara has all the time, that Achri Rabim Lahatos, we follow the majority. That when you have when you have a rove, when you have a majority ruling on a certain case, then we don't follow the minority. Ramosha Feinstein points out that there's one exception to that. The exception to that is when you have the people of the minority's community. Okay, let's say, I'll give you a good example. Chicken and cheese, kosher or not? Not kosher. How do we know it's not kosher? Because the Mishnah tells us in Chulin that the opinion of the rabbis, which means the majority, was there should be a rabbinic enactment made against chicken and cheese, because people are going to end up having cheeseburgers. People are going to end up having meat and cheese because meat and chicken are very similar, and therefore people are going to make mistakes. And we know that chicken, that it's chicken and meat is very similar, right? Vegetarians don't eat either, right? So they're both under the category of something that is animal food, meat mixed with dairy product, and therefore we're going to prohibit it completely. In fact, one opinion in the Mishnah, Rabbi Kiva, actually thinks it's a biblical prohibition, but the rabbis say, no, this is a rabbinic, there's nothing biblically wrong with it. It's a rabbinic enactment. Now, obviously, we have to follow the rabbinic enactment, but they're the majority. There was one opinion that felt there was no problem with it. Rabbi Yossi Haglili felt there was no problem with it. Now, what if me, Daniel Reich, says, you know what? I've learned through the Talmud. In general, I think Rabbi Yossi Haglili is spot on, right? Like I like the way he thinks. So I'm going to go and for lunch tomorrow, I'm going to get myself a turkey and cheese sandwich from Starbucks when I get my coffee. So is that something that's okay? Of course not. Well, why not? Well, because once the majority rules on something, so then I have to follow the majority's ruling. However, the Gemara in Shabbos on Kuf Lamed tells us that that in the place of Rabbi Yossi Haglili, they used to eat chicken and cheese. And the Gemara says that all of the community members of the place of Rabbi Yossi Haglili, where he was rabbi, lived a long life over the fact that they followed the directive of their rabbi. So now that community, being that it was at that time and place, being that they were following their rabbinic authority, and their rabbinic authority was one of the Balei HaMesorah, Rabbi Yossi Haglili, so then therefore there's nothing wrong with them following. In fact, they're rewarded for the fact that they followed their rabbi despite all the fact that the rest of the halacha disagreed with him, because as we mentioned before, elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chaim, both truths are correct. There are two truths. Both opinions are truthful. Both are correct. Now, what exactly? Now, of course, there's a limit on that, right? Once Ravina and Ravashi Sofara, once halacha was established as we're all going to be following the following, right? We're all following this and nothing else. So then that ended. Okay. So now we're 500 years down the mountain. We explained the rabbinic law sufficiently.
Yeah, except the Sanhedrin's decisions
were binding
orally, or they were transmitted
orally. Yeah.
That's
Well, they were accepted by the Sanhedrin. That's what all of oral tradition was. Yeah, all of it was, and that's why Rebbe HaKadosh had to start compiling things, because he felt that things were starting to get lost. Yeah. So now, but there were witnesses on it, meaning like they all sat together and came. And by the way, when the Sanhedrin passes a halacha, they don't write that some of us came to the conclusion of this. They write, we as a whole body come to this conclusion. It's like they become an organic unit, become one organic unit. We all came to this halacha. Okay. So now the Gra tells us around the year 500, 550, around that time, Ravina and Ravashi Sofara, Talmud is concluded, and we have to follow the Talmud. Good. So now we move into application, right? That would be the next place. We move now into application. So what's a Jew to do, right? So now let's put ourselves into, it's around the year 700, 800. We're living somewhere in Spain or in France. And I want to know when I'm going to be making Kiddush on Friday night, should I first make the blessing on the day, or the wine? Should I first make Borei Pri Hagafen, or should I first make the bracha Mikadesh HaShabbos? Which bracha should I make first? So I want to know what to do. So how am I supposed to know what to do? So either I have background, but let's say I don't have background. Let's say I'm someone who's becoming religious. So what am I supposed to do? Essentially, what I'm supposed to do, if I don't have a rabbi to ask, I have to learn. Basically, I have to learn the Talmud. I have to open up a Talmud and I have to figure out based on the Talmud. Now, if I don't have background, that's something that's extremely difficult to do. In fact, it's pretty much impossible to do. It's not really open. It doesn't lend itself to someone who does not have the context of the background to be able to know how to follow Jewish law. So now comes along the Gaonim and the early Rishonim to say that we are going to take it upon ourselves to try and help out our fellow Jew. Okay, now we go to the next side of the page. Or, we could stay on this side of the page. That's fine. There's enough on this page. It's a little bit clearer on this page anyway. Where we have basically two different types of Rishonim. We have the one type of Rishon who's helping the Talmudic scholar. They're helping the person who wants to actually study the Talmud, to understand it, to study Torah for application and also for the sake of studying Torah. Those are like Rashi. Rashi is there as your guide. He's your Rebbe. He's there as your guide to help you study the Talmud. Okay, so that's very helpful. But still, I'm in a predicament right now. I need to know what blessing I'm supposed to make right now. I need to know whether or not it's a problem for me to accept a gift from somebody after I lent them money. Does that constitute interest, or does it not constitute interest for me to accept a gift from them? There are there are so many different scenarios that can come up. I just need to know what to do. I just need to know what to do. So Rashi, while it's very helpful if I'm doing a study of Talmud, the most helpful, it's not very helpful when it comes to knowing how to practice. So here comes into the scene. The first one really to come into the scene that had a major splash and impact was the Rif. Where the Rif comes along, and Rabbeinu Alfasi comes along, 1013 to 1103, and he condenses the entire Talmud into the bottom line halachic statements, where the Talmud comes to two different conclusions, and we don't know how, two different opinions. We don't know how we paskin. Just reading Rashi is not going to help me. He's going to help me understand each respective opinion. It's not going to necessarily help me to understand how we follow. The Rif comes along and says, you know what, I'm just going to condense the entire Talmud into the bottom line halacha. What do we do? Which is very helpful, right? Whereas as I'm reading through the Talmud, and I want to know what to do, so I flip to my next book that's in front of me, and now they publish it all in one volume. I flip to the Rif, and I see, well, what does the Rif say? Rabbeinu Alfasi says that we follow Beis Hillel, and I'm supposed to make my my blessing on my grape juice, on my wine, before I make the blessing on the day. Good, I know exactly what to do. Now, what's the only problem with the Rif? Is it's a problem of geography. I don't know where to look. What if I don't have the requisite background to even know where in the Talmud to where this discussion would be? So comes along the Rambam. But the Rambam says, well, that's what I'm going to step in and do. I'm going to codify all of Torah. Okay, I'm going to organize it. I'm going to codify it. I'm taking like what Rebbe HaKadosh did, I'm taking it to the next level. I'm going to organize it in even more organized fashion. And I'm going to tell you, like the Rif, what the bottom line halacha is. Okay, so this is like the best of both worlds. What's the only problem with that? The problem with that is that the Rambam was giving his opinion. He ignored the fact that there is the Rush, there's Tosfos, there is Rashi, there's the Rif, there's the Rush, the Torah didn't exist yet, but there's all these, the Rush didn't either, but there's all of these other opinions that exist that of what the bottom line halacha should be, how to understand the Talmud, when those two opinions were given, which one do we follow like, even how to understand the opinion we follow like, could have multiple understandings, could have multiple interpretations. So while the Rambam is very organized and very clear, it doesn't really help me in terms of what the bottom line is, because if I'm a Jew living in La Jolla, right? I don't know if there probably weren't Jews living in La Jolla then, but I'm a Jew, there definitely weren't. I'm a Jew living in La Jolla. I don't come from the town of the Rambam. I don't come from the town of the Rif. I don't come from the town of the Rush. I don't come from the town of Tosos. I don't come from these places. So then, who am I supposed to follow? So now comes along the Tur, who is the son of the Rush, to help us out a little bit. The Tur, who's the son of the Rush, starts compiling different opinions, where he makes a book, where he also is going through the bottom line practical halacha, and he's also organizing it, right? And now, mind you, this is all happening in about 1,000-year period. From the time the Talmud is finished until we get to the Rif is about 800, 900 years, okay? And within that time frame, there's all these other Rishonim, those early commentators that are trying to either explain the Talmud or read the Talmud and tell you this is how we follow, this is what our practice is. But now you have all these different opinions, and now if you have someone that comes onto the scene, an individual, a Jew, a practicing Jew that doesn't come from any of those individual communities, who do I follow? Like, so the Torah says, I'm going to make a book that goes through the different opinions. He goes through many of the opinions. He doesn't go through all the opinions. He goes through many of the different opinions, and I'll tell you how we follow. Okay, that was what the Torah did. The Torah was relatively successful, except it was not expansive. He didn't cover everything, and he didn't cover all the opinions, and therefore it was losing some of its authoritativeness. That's why our Rabbi Yosef Karo came into the picture. And this is what was revolutionary about Rav Yosef Karo. Where Rav Yosef Karo said, I'm going to solve all of our problems. I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. I'm going to make it simple. I'm going to follow the outline that Rabbi Yaakov ben Harash, the Tur, had given us. I'm going to follow his same outline, where there's 4 different sections of practical Jewish law, laws of daily living. I don't even know what time it is. This is a classic. Just keep going. You know what time it is?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
20 after 9.
20 after 9. Okay. So there's laws of daily living, of calendar living. There's laws of kashrus and in Yoredeya. There's laws of civil law. There's laws of marital law and Choshen Mishpat and Even Ezer. And I'm going to follow the same outline and an organization that the Torah did. Fine, it's not perfect, whatever. For simplicity, I'll follow what he did. And I'm going to write an encyclopedic work as a commentary to the Torah that expands it and says that not only am I just going to tell you the different opinions, I'm going to go back to the original sources. I'm going to tell you what it says in the Chumash. I'm going to tell you what it says in the Mishnayos, the Sifra, Sifrei, Mechilta, Tosefta. I'm going to tell you what it says in the Talmud. I'm going to say how the different commentaries explain the passages in the Chumash, the Mishnah, and in the Talmud. I'm going to then even get deeper than that. And I'm going to say not only just how to understand the Talmud, but even the different opinions in the bottom line halacha, what the Rambam assumes, what the Rif assumes, what the Rush assumes. And then I'm also going to lay out for you my my scientific method on how I came to my bottom line decision. And that is what he did is he said that it's pretty clear at this point, and he's talking now in around the year 550. He's talking around the year 550. Rabbi Yosef Karo lived 1488 to 1575, and he published his Beis Yosef, this encyclopedia, around the year 550. He says, I'm going to tell you my scientific method. By now, in the 16th century, we know that the Shlosha Amudei Torah, the 3 pillars of halacha, are the Rambam, the Rush, who basically was the most authoritative figure in the Ashkenazic communities, and the Rif. The Rif was basically the first of the authoritative figures. So we have the Rif, the Rambam, and the Rush. Those are, by now we know, and pretty much everyone agrees to, almost everyone agrees to. There was Reb Shlomo Luria who argued with him, the Yamshel Shlomo, who disagreed with this whole methodology, but he was like kind of standalone. But Rav Yosef Karo said that this is, he was a contemporary of his that kind of just like stood alone on that matter. But everyone agrees that they're really the 3 pillars of the halacha, and therefore, based on a majority of those 3 opinions, I'll tell you what the halacha is. Now, if I can't come to, this is what he says, he writes all this. This is my scientific method. If those 3, let's say one of them did not chime in on the matter, or the 3 of them have 3 separate opinions, for example, and I don't have a majority, then I'll take the rulings of all the other Rishonim, Rashi, Tosos, the Tosos Rid, Tosos Rabbeinu Peretz, all of the other Rishonim, the Trumas Hadeshen, everyone else that was kind of like, we'll call them, quote unquote, second tier poskim, then I'll make it a majority opinion based on a survey of all of the opinions. Okay, so and basically, and he made this encyclopedia. It's an incredible work. It took him about 20 years to put together. We were starting around the year 1530 while he was traveling through the Ottoman Empire, and completed around the year 1550 in Tzfat. I mean, it's like he accomplished all the issues. And then he said, now that's a massive work, right? It's massive work. This is the work that really will tell you how we get from Sinai till right now, and how you are supposed to know how to follow, how you're supposed to follow the Judaism, follow halacha. And then he said, but you know what? It's almost impossible to be able to, right? Then we get back to our original issue. What was our original issue? Our original issue is that it almost becomes like the Talmud, right? Right, where it's like, I still need some background, like the Rif. I need some background to know where to look, right? This also is going to require me to, I'd have to read through an entire encyclopedic entry just to know what bracha to make first on a Friday night of Hagafen or Mekadesh Shabbos. So I need to know the quick answer. She says, so, I'll make an index. Make an index that is a review system as well. In fact, the original publications of the work included a calendar, a 30-day calendar to review through the index called the Shulchan Aruch once every 30 days. And then, therefore, you're going to have the quick reference guide called the Shulchan Aruch, and you're going to have my Beis Yosef, the encyclopedic work, the more authoritative work that you can always come back to. Okay? There's so much more to say. There's so much more to say, but I think we ran out of time. But let's put a bookmark right here. We'll finish it next time. Let's finish this next time because there's a lot more to discuss because we still have about 500 years left in the mountain that we need to climb down. But basically, what we're come to now in the history books is the first time where we have in now coming to since Torah Messina, the first time we have a completely all-encompassing halachic work. I'm sorry, the second time. The first time was the completion of the Talmud, right? Now it was less accessible than the Shulchan Aruch. Now the second time is the Shulchan Aruch. This is the first time. This, by the way, is going to be the dividing line, as we're pointed out by Rabbi Soloveitchik. This is now going to be the dividing line between what we call the Rishonim and the Achronim. That's what we'll pick up and discuss more next time, where the place of how the Ramah fits into it, and then how all the modern day poskim then follow suit. But this is where we're up to now. So we've basically just a quick review of how we climb down, receive the Torah from Sinai, all of the elucidations and commentary and discussion on the written text and on the oral traditions, and new rabbinic law, that was legislations that were passed by the Sanhedrin and by the Anshe Knesset Hagdola, were all contained within the Talmud. When the Talmud was completed, that ended the ability for new legislation to be passed. That was already the end of it. And then it was a matter of application of the halacha that was completed in the Talmud. That was attempted to be done by the Gaonim and by the early Rishonim. And what developed was many different opinions found in all of the authoritative works of the Rishonim, the Rambam, the Rif, the Rush, Tosos, the Ramban, the Baal Ma'or, the Tosos Rid, Tosos Rabbeinu Peretz, all of those opinions. So then we came to, well, so what am I supposed to do? Who am I supposed to follow? I don't come from all of their individual communities. So what am I supposed to do? So that's where Rabbi Yosef Karo came up with the scientific method of halacha that we're going to follow. The majority, first step is to see how we can follow the majority following the three pillars of Torah law, the Rambam, the Rif, and the Rush. But if we don't have the ability to just look at the three of them, either because there's three separate opinions and they're not, two of them are not in agreement, or one of them didn't chime in on the matter, then we'll take a survey of all the opinions, and he explains all that in his encyclopedia, coming to the bottom line halacha in the Beis Yosef, and then it created a review system and index called the Shulchan Aruch as a quick reference guide. That is what we're up to right now. We're now holding by the year 1550 the publication of the Shulchan Aruch, and really how that revolutionized halacha in the way that we practice it today. Okay, good. We'll pick up from here next time. Aruch set. A set table. Yeah, a set table. All right, good. I'm going to share this outline with everybody, so that way it'll be a little bit easier to follow next time. And we'll pick up from here next week. All right. Thanks, everybody. Good night.
You say basic principle would be that